Saturday, April 20th, 1985. Teenage sweethearts Nicola Myers and Kenneth McBride were walking on an isolated hill in a Hong Kong country park.
These were a couple of young people on a hillside.
Braemar Hill was a quiet refuge where the couple could study and plan their future together.
Two young people in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And the crime committed against them was particularly gruesome.
Any form of violent crime towards its patrons was practically unknown.
Never come across a body with that many injuries.
The community was in an uproar and demanded answers.
Nobody assumed that they would even get involved in this kind of criminal attack. There was extreme levels of shock.
Then, when the killers were finally arrested, they turned out to be as young as their victims.
The situation's just rapidly developed. I think it's highly unlikely that they planned or intended the outcome.
Unexplainable things happened which resulted in these two young people dying.
Hong Kong is one of the most densely populated cities in the world, yet about 40% of the land area is made up of uninhabited hilly country parks, crisscrossed with hiking trails, many of them close to residential areas. They form a backbone to Hong Kong Island, with green spurs on the lower slopes reaching out to touch the concrete of the city. This allows walkers easy access to locations like Braemar Hill, quiet, yet close to main roads and separated visually by dissecting ridgelines. This was where teenagers Nicola Myers and Kenneth McBride were headed Saturday afternoon, April 20th, 1985, after they left his parents' home in nearby Braemar Hill Mansions. Kenneth had a broken collarbone from a cycling accident, and his left arm was in a sling. They knew a quiet place, only a short walk away. It was relatively out of sight, beyond a ridge of hills, where they could study for upcoming exams. It's only when they failed to return home that night that their families started to worry. Kenneth's father searched the hillside at 1 a.m., but there was no sign of the teenagers. Searching again in the morning, the parents reported them missing after finding one of Kenneth's school books. An official search was about to launch, but it never started. And later that morning, the teens' parents would have to confront a horrifying reality. Sunday, April 21st, 1985, a bank manager jogging in the country park saw two badly beaten bodies lying on the hillside. Retired Detective Trevor Collins worked on the case. 25 years later, he still vividly remembers the crime scene.
I was with the Organised Serious Crimes Bureau at the time, and we were called out almost immediately once they discovered the bodies.
The horrific scene that Chief Inspector Collins and the other officers came across had never been encountered in Hong Kong before. Two British teenage students beaten, tortured, and murdered. 17-year-old Kenneth had visible wounds to most of his body, with bruises across his neck. His hands and feet were bound, and his Nike sports shoes were missing. 18-year-old Nicola was found partially naked. She had been raped. Her body showed over 500 wounds, the result of a prolonged and brutal attack.
It was an extremely violent attack. There was a huge amount of injuries on both Nicola and Kenneth. It was pretty horrific. And we never actually, I've worked in homicide for a number of years on several occasions and serious crimes, and never come across a body with that many injuries.
Former Assistant Commissioner of Police Dave Hodson, now with the University of Hong Kong Center for Criminology, was in charge of the regional CID. Like everyone else who encountered the horrific scene, what Hodson witnessed that Sunday morning is still very clear in his mind, even decades later.
I received the early call out, as it were, and went to the scene as soon as I got there and reported back that they were two expats. It seemed that they had been brutally murdered. Then the reaction was that this should be dealt with immediately by the Braemar investigation group.
The missing persons inquiry became a double murder investigation. And with the sadistic killer or killers still on the loose, the Organized and Serious Crime Bureau set about finding what happened on Braemar Hill.
We conducted a search of the area to try and find as much evidence as we could, exhibits. We eventually used almost 400 men to comb the area. It's quite a difficult area to comb. It's a hillside, country park, not too many pathways. So sweeping the area for exhibits was quite difficult.
Because of the remote location, Nicola and Kenneth's bodies had to be flown off the hillside.
We used the helicopter because the bodies couldn't be carried down from the hill. It was too difficult, so we arranged a helicopter to pick up the bodies, taken to the British Military Hospital, and then they were transported to the Victoria Public Mortuary, where the postmortems were held the next day.
By this stage, alongside the detectives, 3 squadrons of the police tactical unit were also scouring the hillside for evidence.
So it was a very, very difficult scene. Again, there's a lot of shrubbery, there's a lot of rubbish there as well, and every single item that was found was marked, staked, photographed, and then catalogued. So it was a very difficult scene.
The reason for this methodical approach: detectives were coming across vital pieces of evidence scattered all across the hillside.
Quite a lot of items were found in a small stream which runs from close to where the bodies were found down to the back of Braemar Hill Mansions. And these included a lot of school books, exercise books, a lot of them were torn.
Piecing together the story of how the teenagers were killed would be a monumental task, leading to one of the largest and most intensive manhunts in Hong Kong's history.
I think multiple homicides are always unusual and have never been the accepted state of affairs. So 2 people being killed at the same time was unusual, and for them to be, frankly, 2 expats was extremely unusual.
It was an extraordinary feeling because it's just not what Hong Kong is. It wasn't what Hong Kong was. It's not what Hong Kong is now. Hong Kong's a very, very safe place, and this was something right out of left field. It was just totally different. It was just not real.
Every killing's awful. It must be a most horrendous thing, but there was something about this one which was just such a total waste, such a total lack of any explanation as to why it happened.
In 1985, Island School students Nicola Myers and Kenneth McBride were found brutally murdered in one of Hong Kong's isolated country parks, Braemar Hill. It sparked one of the largest investigations in the city's history, putting immense pressure on police to solve one of Hong Kong's most vicious and unexplained crimes.
It was almost a linked arm, hand-in-hand sort of search, so that every possible inch was covered, from the bottom of the hill going up to the top of the hill, and that took 3 or 4 days.
The scale of the search and widespread media coverage of the case threatened to add racial and political dimensions to the investigation.
There was extreme levels of shock, and then the shock turned because a lot of particularly the Chinese media, started saying, oh, the only reason the police are so interested in this is precisely because these are 2 white kids. Would the same level of attention be paid if these were 2 Chinese kids being murdered? I think the truth is, probably not.
The police took a more pragmatic approach than the Chinese media and treated the murders as a straightforward crime.
There was a large turnout of police in the early stages, and that caused the media and people to speculate, why is this case being given so much priority? Simply, you have to search a hill.
we didn't do it because they were expatriates. We'd have done exactly the same if it had been locals.
The massive police operation into the double murder and public concerns about preferential treatment for expatriates came at a time when confidence in the city was already being challenged. Uncertainty clouded Hong Kong in 1985, as it had during previous political changes. With only 12 years till China resumed sovereignty in 1997, doubts about the future had crept into the psyche of the population.
In the mid-80s, crime was beginning to increase. Throughout the 80s, in some areas Hong Kong was law-abiding, but there was gang activity. There were some violent robberies which peaked a few years later. So there were concerns that the state of law and order might deteriorate.
The expat community, though, was mainly immune to this, unless caught up in random criminal acts.
Never heard of any such crime happening. We obviously had small incidents, but never anything as dramatic as this. I mean, even a serious robbery was unheard of for European school kids.
Therefore, the unexpected and unexplained violent deaths of the two British teenagers sent shockwaves throughout Hong Kong. Nicola and Kenneth lived an almost cocooned lifestyle away from the cramped housing estates. Their families weren't rich by Western standards, but their relatively large flats were virtually unattainable by local standards. They attended island school in the upmarket mid-levels area on Hong Kong Island. The good-looking couple were well known on campus and shared common interests. Kenneth was president of the student union and captain of the rowing team. He was also a poet who wrote about the love of his life, Nicola. She was beautiful, with big brown eyes and wavy hair. Nicola was also smart, had an interest in languages, and was hoping to become an interpreter.
They seemed very close, so they obviously knew each other quite well through school. And it seemed to be a very, very strong relationship, and may well have been one of those which lasted from school all the way through.
News of their deaths stunned the close school community.
It was so far out and weird and impossible to know that someone that you knew had been murdered, and in such a brutal way. I mean, even the thought of it now still sends sort of tingles up and down my spine.
The shock of two of the students being murdered in 1985 was absolutely devastating. They were very much part of the community, and it was felt, and a lot of people were tremendously hurt by the whole thing. They felt they'd personally been injured by it.
Meanwhile, the double murder investigation was proving problematic for the police. A lack of good evidence and the remote location provided little for detectives to work with.
Not one person heard, saw, or had any idea of how or when this did happen. So very, very difficult. We didn't have eyewitnesses. We didn't have any sort of physical evidence per se.
As a result of the intensive search, they discovered 3 pieces of wood they believed formed the murder weapon. And there was a partial fingerprint on the broken club. Other prints had been found on school books torn up by the killers. However, when experts pored over a criminal fingerprint database in police headquarters, they found no matches. They also recovered semen and blood samples from Nicola's body, along with her ripped clothing. But in the days before widespread DNA analysis, the fluid samples did not help the investigation much. A picture, though, gradually emerged from the crime scene, especially in relation to what happened to Kenneth.
From the injuries that was discovered, there was a lot of defensive type wounds on there. So it obviously put up quite a big struggle, so there had to be more than 2, let's say, culprits.
he had sustained more than 100 injuries, proof that despite a broken collarbone, he had tried to fight off their attackers. Nicola had suffered more than 500 wounds in a vicious, prolonged attack. The police now knew they were looking for more than one person, and the net was cast wider and wider in the hope of a breakthrough.
We then decided to look at possible suspects, and what we did was every single police station on Hong Kong Island to start with, any stop and search had been conducted by any police officer involving 2 or more people. We would get details of those and question them, locate and question them.
The Organized and Serious Crime Bureau also canvassed the area in ever-expanding circles from the crime scene, in what was one of the largest manhunts in the city. And as the investigation dragged on, various theories were explored. Did a gang already operating in the area kill the students? Or was it a part of a triad initiation ceremony? Both theories were eventually dismissed, but the triad link would turn out to be a crucial part of the puzzle. One of the largest manhunts in Hong Kong's history was launched after the brutal murders of 2 teenage students in 1985. The police conducted door-to-door inquiries in the hunt for the killers of Nicola Myers and Kenneth McBride.
And it ended up with some 18,000 people being interviewed at the end of the days, and about 180 separate sort of groups of people that we sort of tried to locate and question, who were sort of identified as possible suspects.
Detectives interviewed every family living in registered properties within the search grid. What they didn't know was that their primary suspect was living in an unusual residence in the same area.
At the same time, we looked at finding informers, looking for information on people who might know anything about this, might be dealing with it, have talked about it.
But the sheer scope of the investigation led to an unforeseen problem. The police had no efficient way of processing the vast quantities of data resulting from their investigation. A solution had to be found, so Collins flew to London to look at a computer system that was introduced after the Yorkshire Ripper serial murder case, allowing detectives to compile and view information from multiple crime scenes.
I'm not sure it helped us solve it, but it helped us sort of speed up the way we could handle the information that was coming in.
Data produced by the new system was used to pinpoint suspects and key locations. Using it, they narrowed down 18,000 people interviewed to 180 possible suspects, but they were still no closer to solving the murders of teenage sweethearts Nicola Myers and Kenneth McBride.
We had a number of forensic exhibits in the form of blood, semen. So we had a blood grouping, as it was in those days, because we didn't have the luxury of DNA. And it was a matter of eliminating people as we went along with regard to the blood grouping.
A new approach was needed. While in London, Collins hand-carried items of evidence found on Braemar Hill to the Home Office laboratories for analysis. Scientists working with the British police were at the forefront of identifying trace evidence in crime cases. With no similar facilities available in Hong Kong, Collins and his colleagues could only hope for a breakthrough.
There was like a partial fingerprint in blood or mud with a hair, all in the same mark, and it was very difficult to examine it without damaging it. We also asked them to examine them under other new methods, fingerprints in particular.
But the prints were too poor to produce any conclusive results, even with the new technology. Detectives now needed a break in the case, as the information they had was not enough to take the investigation further. Even a police reward for 50,000 Hong Kong dollars yielded nothing. But when an anonymous Chinese businessman raised the amount, $500,000 Hong Kong dollars, it led to a tip that unlocked the case.
This, of course, was a huge sum of money in those days, and we started to get all sorts of information coming in as a result of that reward.
No, it wasn't common. It isn't common for private individuals to come up with large rewards. But there was quite a lot of interest in this case, and it had got emotions running.
Surprisingly, the tip came from a known underworld figure.
A lot of it was of no use, but eventually we got some information regarding the first arrested person, in fact, who'd gone to his triad boss and asked for help financially because he'd committed the Braemar murders.
Tempted by the cash payout, a Fuk Yi Hing triad gangster called one of Colin's colleagues. In a subsequent meeting, the triad told the detective one of his followers, Peng Sheng-yi, had confessed he had killed Nicola and Kenneth. The tip went a long way to unraveling a myth about the triads and their 36 blood oaths, a loyalty test that dates back centuries to the origins of Chinese gangs. Although the oaths lay out a fearsome set of punishments for offenders, the breaking of this ancient underworld code by a gang member was no surprise to criminologist and former Assistant Commissioner of Police, Dave Hodson.
That's all nonsense. People do things for money. It's as simple as that. Why are many of these? There are many reasons why people are involved in criminal activities, in gang activities, but money is a significant factor in quite a range of criminal activities.
He wouldn't have been over popular, that's for sure. He wouldn't have won too many friends, but I guess with his $550,000, he'd have had a more different lifestyle than he had with without it.
In the Braemar Hill murder investigation, the police ignored their traditional mistrust of the Chinese mafia and listened to the tough triad boss, albeit an informer looking for payment. November 1985, the Organized and Serious Crime Bureau launched an operation to find 24-year-old Peng Sheng-yi, the alleged killer.
Having interviewed the triad protector, his protector in fact, we managed to identify him. Over a course of several weeks we finally located him and eventually arrested him.
Later the same day, over the course of several interviews, Peng confessed to his part in the murders and gave police the names of 4 accomplices.
After we arrested the first one, yes, it was corroborated by the second one, so that was it. We knew there was 5, and all 5 were picked up, say, by the 11:30 the following night.
The other 4, Tam Si-foon, Chu Wai-man, Chong Yao-hang, and Wan Sam-lung, were arrested without incident. They also found a pair of Nike sports shoes with Tam, exactly the same as Kenneth's. This was a major step in solving the double murder. After searching for the killers for more than 6 months, they now had 5 suspects in custody within 48 hours, and they weren't looking for anyone else.
I think if we didn't have such a large reward, it would have gone on. I mean, eventually we'd have caught them, but it would have gone on for a long, long time.
And it was only then that detectives discovered 2 of the killers were teenagers.
A bit of a shock when you found out the age of them, but it made no difference. We still treated them as potential murder suspects and dealt with them accordingly.
As the manhunt ended, detectives started to use a different skill set. They needed to get the suspects to trust them and to talk.
It's a mind game in getting people to cooperate. Getting a rapport in the first place is the key.
Detectives knew they had the right people, but with no usable fingerprints and little other hard evidence that linked them to the crime so far, they needed more before going to court. If the police could get a confession, then they would have a strong case against all 5. The suspects were kept in different police stations and interviewed on numerous occasions over a period of weeks and months. Concerns about the case were quickly put to rest as they all made a series of caution statements detailing everything that had happened on the afternoon of April 20th, 1985.
Once it was put to them, openly admitted it.
So for the first time since the murders 7 months earlier, the police now knew what happened and who did it. But would it be enough to convict them? A reward of $500,000 Hong Kong dollars unlocked the triad code of silence in the 7-month hunt for the killers of Island School students Nicola Myers and Kenneth McBride. 5 suspects were arrested on November 27th and 28th, 1985 for the brutal murders and would face trial for their own lives. But they were not the hardened killers everyone thought they'd be. Apart from a few minor crimes, they were unknown to the police, and 2 were teenagers, younger than their victims. And now they faced the reality of their actions.
They were obviously very remorseful. I mean, they had never been involved in any such thing before, and they were, very upset. They said they're very sorry for the families, and they didn't mean to do it. It just happened, and it was unfortunate.
They all confessed in police interviews. Each one corroborated what the other said. For the first time since the murders in April 1985, detectives knew what happened.
It is by skillful use of stress in these areas, of increasing his concerns, that you get results. So it is a mind game.
According to Wan Sam Lung's statement, he and 2 of the others were opening car doors for money on the day of the attack. Pang was the leader of their group. He suggested they go out to steal cables from government aerials.
They went out to play, is what they said. They couple of drinks, bit of food. They wanted more money for more food and drink. Decided to steal this copper. Couldn't get the copper, had no way of removing it from the aerials. Decided to try and rob someone.
Pang led the other 4 across the hills. Unknown to police, he had been living in a wooden hut in a nearby quarry and knew the area well.
And they walked around and they thought, well, let's find someone to rob. And it's because it's very secluded, and although there is a very sort of popular walkway there wasn't too many people around. In fact, there was hardly anyone around.
According to Wan's evidence, they spotted Nicola and Kenneth and thought since they were Europeans, they must have money. Pang split the gang up so they could approach in a pincer movement from 2 directions.
Unfortunately for Nicola and Kenneth, they only had $1 on them, and they told them they had no money and tried to sort of defend themselves, in fact. But the gang didn't believe them, and anyway, this became a frenzied attack.
As the interviews with the suspects continued, more details came out. The police now knew that Pang was the instigator and why there were defensive wounds on Nicola and Kenneth. They also confirmed the broken wooden handle found in the stream was the murder weapon and was picked up by Pang prior to the attack.
And in fact, Pang did say that they rushed them. I think his exact words was, they rushed us. And it just became a fight. And they overpowered them, and they had various tools. They picked up a piece of wood, similar to a sort of almost a pickaxe type hand or half of one, and used that, and they just overpowered them.
Kenneth was savagely beaten and his hands and feet tied up. Tam pulled off Kenneth's Nike shoes and took them. According to their statements, Pang verbally threatened the other 4 to take part in the attack, so they would all be involved.
I mean, it's like hold him down and stop him from struggling, right? Hit him. You hit him, I have to hit him, we all hit him.
Kenneth was then asphyxiated with the wooden handle before Pang started on Nicola in what would be a prolonged and sadistic attack lasting hours. While Pang was raping her, the others had time to smoke cigarettes, but stayed close. Peng decided the two teenagers must die, since they would be able to identify them.
He took control and yeah, he orchestrated what happened, the way that the violence took place.
Collins revisits the site for the first time since the murders, and the remote crime scene is now unrecognizable.
Well, it's difficult as much as that the scene's changed completely. Even the pathways have changed. The trees here are immense, whereas before it was just short shrub. Now you've got trees that are, 20 feet high. Of course, over the 25 years, the whole thing has changed.
But he still remembers the details and what happened on April 20th, 1985.
Well, they come from up there, the top of the hill is the mast where they originally went to try and steal the copper from. And there's pathways that lead all the way down following the stream to this sort of area. And then walking along there, they noticed the couple sitting there studying, and that's when they made the decision to try and rob them.
Afterwards, the five killers scattered their victims' belongings in a stream and on the hillside as they tried to destroy any evidence. They then split up and left the country park, hoping the bodies wouldn't be discovered before they escaped. It was only by chance that the jogger spotted them the next morning.
And as he came round the hill towards this bridge, he could see what appeared to be two bodies lying on the bank. You can't see it from anywhere else unless you were specifically looking for it. So he noticed that and immediately went and dialed the 999 looking for the police.
With the suspects in custody and talking, the police discovered one of the reasons it took so long to find them. None had committed any crimes like this before.
No, they weren't career criminals. They were just young, let's say young kids. Two of them were very young, but their criminality, they extended to just petty crime. A couple of them used to work as almost beggars, opening taxi doors in Kuntong Ferry Pier. They're begging money, same as they used to do at Star Ferry as well. So they weren't career criminals at all.
It was obvious to detectives that Peng, a casual worker and known low-level gangster, was the leader and a bully.
He was a member of the Fuki Hing Tri Society, and he was just a low-level, sort of just a soldier, footman. He wasn't known as a fighter.
As part of the interrogation process, all five voluntarily took part in reenactments at the actual crime scene. All the visits were videoed and would be used in court, which was a relatively new concept at the time.
They volunteered to reconstruct the whole scenario, and they led police all around the hills, although several of them couldn't identify 100% where the scene was, but the general area.
Well, that's an extension of a voluntary statement. So obviously participation in these case reconstructions must be voluntary, but it is very dramatic because it's oral, it's visual, and it can make a big impression on people who watch it, and it also can add great veracity to the statement if the guy can point things out and you can see this happening.
Despite giving cautioned statements detailing the murders and reenacting the crime on video, all pleaded not guilty heading into the trial. But in September 1986, while in custody, the youngest, Juan, changed his mind and admitted his guilt, and agreed to give evidence against the others. Juan Sam Long was only 15 at the time of the murders. He became the star witness for the prosecution. Because of his age, he was ordered to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, which meant an indefinite prison sentence. As the trial date neared, the police had accumulated a mass of evidence. Witnesses, including the triad-turned-informant, cautioned confessions from the defendants, and video reenactments of the crime, played out by the accused themselves. But the available physical evidence of fingerprints and blood groupings was not guaranteed to convince the jury, and with no forensic DNA analysis, detectives were concerned it would not be enough to connect the defendants to the double murder. And now, one of the five would give evidence against the four co-accused, but would it be enough to convict them? In April 1985, Hong Kong Island school students Nicola Myers and Kenneth McBride were murdered in a brutal random crime. 4 men accused of their deaths had pleaded not guilty. A 5th suspect had already admitted his part in their killings and agreed to testify for the prosecution. When the High Court proceedings started in late November 1986, the case was back on the front pages.
It was the kind of story that you would expect even more coverage in the press, and it sure got it.
Senior counsel, legal expert, and author Andrew Bruce explains why, 19 months after the murders, the case still gripped Hong Kong.
There is something very special about every murder case, and in that sense, this was no different to any other case. But as I say, it had that element of the unexplained, and I guess in that sense it was unique.
And the public wanted these murders explained. Why did these 2 students die in such a sadistic manner? The Crown prosecution presented 150 exhibits, including 18 bundles of photographs, audio and video of the accused, the murder weapon, and items of clothing. There were also 37 witnesses, including Wan Sam Lung, who confessed to his part in the double murder. One was being held indefinitely at Her Majesty's pleasure, in line with sentencing guidelines relevant at the time. In the opening address, the prosecution described to the packed court how Nicola and Kenneth died horrible deaths because their assailants were afraid of being identified. The all-male jury heard it was a killing frenzy in which 5 young men set out to tease and rob the pair. Evidence revealed Myers sustained more than 500 injuries and had been raped during the ordeal. She died of multiple wounds, brain hemorrhage, and cerebral contusions. McBride, lying nearby, had 100 wounds and was killed by asphyxiation after the wooden handle had been forced across his neck. A key exhibit was the pair of Nikes. They were taken from Kenneth by Tam and later seized by police in his possession.
I mean, the fact that one of them hung on to the shoes and didn't discard them, and in fact, I believe boasted about the fact that he had the victim's shoes on, shows an aspect of their thinking.
Wan's evidence was pivotal to the prosecution's case as he recounted the roles the accused played in the murders.
It takes it out of just the recitation of what the police saw and heard and wrote down and recorded in their interviews. And juries like to see something more than just a confession.
The evidence against the 4 was compelling. At 6:05 p.m. on January 20th, after 56 days and having deliberated for 5 hours, the jury returned to Number 7 Court with unanimous guilty verdicts. Pang, Tam, and Chu received the death penalty, but Hong Kong courts had not executed a convict in years, and so their sentences were automatically commuted to life in prison. Since Chung was under 18 at the time of the crime, he was ordered to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure or held indefinitely in jail. The youngest killer, Wan, had already been detained under the same guidelines, having admitted his guilt before the trial.
There's nothing more sort of satisfying than you know, having, especially in a case like this where it was 7 months of hard work, they all got convicted. It's always very satisfying.
Kenneth's father, Hugh McBride, gave a newspaper interview that was published 4 days after the end of the trial.
We took the decision early on not to dwell on what might have been, but to look at what we had rather than what we lost.
In memory of the pair and their desires to help the needy, the Nicola Myers and Kenneth McBride Memorial Fund was set up by the families, friends, and school to help underprivileged students in Hong Kong.
Each year a nomination form goes out to the principals of the local schools, and they nominate kids who work hard but have financial hardship, and so would benefit greatly by staying at school, but for whom financially it's a struggle.
While both families now live in the UK, the fund continues to help up to 100 underprivileged students every year. As for the killers, the leader of the gang, Peng Chun-yi, is still in prison along with his fellow Fuk Yi-hing triad, Chu Wai-man, who was also found guilty of the murders. Tam Si-foon, who stole Kenneth's Nike tennis shoes, died of cancer in 2009 in prison. He was 45 years old. After the handover from the British to the Chinese in 1997, the law allowing underage offenders to be held indefinitely was amended. Both Wan Sam Lung and Chung Yao Hang were eventually given fixed jail sentences and are now both free. The McBrides' unselfish and magnanimous nature, which helped them deal with the loss of their son, surfaced again during Wan's incarceration. This time, in a letter to then Chief Executive Tung Chee-hwa in 1998, they asked for Wan to be forgiven. Wan was the youngest of the murderers, and the only one to plead guilty and testify against his fellow murderers. He was eventually freed on September 28, 2004, after 19 years in jail. On his release, Hugh McBride gave an interview to a Scottish newspaper in which he said they miss Nicola and Kenneth every day, but he again showed remarkable compassion to his son's killers. After Wan walked out of prison, surrounded by the media, he made an emotional public apology.
我先想同受害者家人講幾句説話先咯，就係我曾經為佢哋帶嚟咁大嘅傷害，我知道我呢世都冇辦法能夠補償，我同佢講聲對唔住，我好多謝佢哋對我原諒同埋寬恕。
Hong Kong legislator Leung Yu-chung, who helped Wan and Chung by pressing Chief Executive Tung Chee-hwa to amend the law, claims both are trying to start new lives.
They don't know what could they do, so they just think that they themselves not to commit any crimes again.
Long says that they're trying to work and reintegrate into society, but never discuss the murders. And while the legal aspect of the case is concluded, the personal side still continues.
I mean, there's always a sense of closure in terms of, you know, that the culprits have been found and they're being punished, but there was never a sense that, you know, that ended it. I mean, people still missed Kenneth and Nicola terribly and still wanted to remember their lives.
It's an event which Hong Kong will never forget. It's an event which the school will never forget. I would hope that nothing ever like this would ever happen to anyone who was at that school. There's no reason ever for them to be forgotten.
Nicola Myers and Kenneth McBride were victims of a violent random meeting of cultures and social class. They paid the ultimate price for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. As memories of the gruesome murders fade, it's the names of the promising island school teenagers that remain in the public consciousness, while those of their killers are forgotten.
In many killings, be they murder or manslaughter, there is usually some form of explanation as to why this happened. But here there was just no explanation. You never forget cases like this.